Hello, everyone. I'm Juan Carlos, the Deputy Director of the New Haven Pride Center, and I want to welcome you to this conversation that we're having today as part of Pride New Haven. Today, we're going to have a really cool conversation about what it means to be queer and Muslim, and we have two amazing folks with us today. I'm going to go ahead and bring on my friend Ahmed, and I am going to have them introduce themselves to you all.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Juan Carlos, and everyone at the Pride Center for having us. Really excited to be here. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Ahmad Abojaradeh, they, them pronouns. I used to be a Connecticut resident, still sort of am. Over the last year, I've kind of been in grad school in Northern Ireland. Just really incredibly excited to be a part of this conversation. I have about 10, 12 years of experience with organizing work within various communities. In particular, I've been supporting the refugee, queer and trans Muslim community in the United States over the last 8 years or so, predominantly in Massachusetts and Connecticut. There are just so many things that we want to talk about, so I'll just leave that introduction as very brief as possible and invite Shaamsuldhin to join us, and we can just jump right in.
Sorry, I was muted. There's Shaamsuldhin right there. It's been quite the day for technology today. So I'm waiting for our guest of honor to fully connect here. I think there's something in the stars. There's something when there's big events like this that, I feel like Wednesday is the day that everything sort of starts acting up. But that just means that we're going to have an even better Pride this Saturday. So the events tomorrow are going to be amazing. And on Friday are going to be even better. And on Saturday, because it's been quite a fascinating day for technology. So in the meantime, you were talking about you doing some work in Western Mass. Is that what you said? Can you tell us a little bit about
that? In Massachusetts and Connecticut. So it's actually a really great story in terms of it's. It was kind of like one of my ways of getting into all the other work that I was doing. So I believe it was 6-7 years ago, I was asked to come and speak at a university in Western Mass. And at the time, I didn't know any other queer or trans Muslims in the state, right? I didn't really know anybody. And the organizer at the time knew that there was a trans Muslim refugee there who was an unaccompanied minor. And so they were there with the social worker. They were 16 at the time. And this person really wanted to introduce us, right? She was like, oh my God, the two trans Muslims are here, right? This never happens. Let's introduce the two of you. And I remember at the time, I was like, oh my God, this is so exciting, right? I'm more than happy to go and talk to this person. And the social worker, who is a white woman, with this individual was not having it. She was not happy that the two of us were talking, whatsoever. It was almost as if she saw me as threatening, which I'm imagining is just her own internalized biases and things like that. And I remember as that happened, we still had a little bit of a conversation and everything, but she kind of took away this person immediately and completely separated, would not let them follow up with me at all, and things like that. And that was a wake-up call in terms of we don't really have many people advocating for us as queer and trans Muslims, right? Yeah. And unfortunately, we don't always have community within even the queer and trans community or the broader Muslim community or the immigrant community or so many other communities. And it was a wake-up call in the sense of we have to do this work, right? Yeah. No one else is going to do it for us. And so that was actually the start of a lot of my own peer support practice and various organizing work, and just continuously I was doing work prior to it, but that was how I kind of got started specifically within the trans and queer community, really anywhere, and just kind of continued doing that work. And it's a very invisible type of work, where you don't normally have space for queer and trans Muslims to be centered or have conversations. And it's always really interesting where anytime I bring up queer and trans Muslims, like even people organizing within the queer and trans community are like, wait, that's a thing? Like they exist? And I'm like, you've known me for 2 years. And they're still like, that's not real.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, to this day, it's still like fairly invisible.
Yeah. It's to me, I find it so fascinating, sort of some of the to put it lightly, I guess, some of the fascinating sort of ideas that folks have about Muslim folks, and then about either non-binary or trans folks, and then if you put those together, it creates this fascinating storm where people are like, "Wait, what?" So it's just it's really fascinating. So our guest of honor may be connected. I'm going to try to bring them on and see. I know that they're having a little bit of an issue with their camera, but we might be able to at least get some audio. Actually, I can't bring them on. It says backstage in this fancy screen that I'm looking at that they're having issues with their mic and camera. But listen, in the meantime, we'll keep talking. I have my younger brother is Muslim, and we have a lot of conversations about where religion and things like sexuality sort of connect, and so we talk a lot about this. So it's really awesome to talk about someone else that's not directly related to me, because we're family in a way. We've known each other for a while, and I'm a huge admirer of all the work that you do, Ahmad, in Connecticut. So you come to the university and do this conversation. What happened? What happens next? Is that the moment where you're like, I'm going to start this organization here in Connecticut? I want to know more about how that started, because the work is so awesome.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it was a bit of a long journey. So initially, actually, prior to Life in My Days, and a lot of people don't know this, I actually supported co-founding another organization out in central Massachusetts. And that one specifically worked with the most marginalized Muslims. And it worked directly with individuals, and it also worked with various support systems. So child protective services and refugee resettlement workers and things like that, to really try to find a way to bridge the gaps, right, of how do we actually make those places safe for queer and trans Muslims.
Right.
And that was incredible work, and I definitely absolutely love doing it. The reason I ended up splitting and kind of starting a completely different thing is because I learned this. I'm grateful that I learned this fairly early on, right? But there's limitations to how many identities we're willing to be inclusive of within nonprofits, right? We love single identity issues, right? Sometimes we'll love 2 identity issues, 3 if we're being amazing. But once you get beyond that, then it's whoa, we're just confusing everyone. Mm-hmm. And for me, as a person, right, who does have a refugee background, who's a displaced Indigenous Palestinian, who's disabled, who's queer, who's trans, who's Muslim, right, and various other identities, right, that doesn't work for me on a personal level, in the sense of it just doesn't fit for even just someone like me, right? And so it really, I guess I found it as a little problematic in terms of my own experiences to try to make my work fit into a model that would never have worked for me, right? Because it wouldn't have really been inclusive of me. And I really wanted to be working with the most marginalized of the most marginalized, whatever that looks like, beyond just single or 2 identities and things like that. And that's really where Life in My Days kind of came from. It became kind of my pathway to be able to do work in a way that I wasn't really seeing with a lot of nonprofits at the time, of really going beyond single identities or even just a few different identities, and really honoring that folks' intersectionalities are so complex, especially when you have 5, 6, 7 identities of marginalization, and we need space. And recognizing that to build that space, we actually need to go and create foundations of specific values versus coming at it from the identities themselves. And that's really the work that I was doing with Life in My Days at the time, right? Of really building space for the most marginalized and the most marginalized, whatever those identities were, which was always a struggle, right? Because even in terms of funding, in terms of like networking, in terms of all those things, you're always asked to define what the identities you're working with are. So anytime I mention like queer and trans Muslims, they're like, okay, so you're working with queer and trans Muslims. And I'm like, well, I'm actually also working with like disabled refugees, right, who are also queer and trans Muslims.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm also working with like indigenous folks and like this and this. And they're like, whoa, like, what do you mean? How are you doing this? That's not cool. Like, you can't do this. And I'm like, no, if you build the foundation, like people will show up, right? Like it can't be a space for everyone. And that's kind of what happened with Life in My Days, and that kind of fed a lot into the various organizing work that I did, fed into the mutual aid work that I kind of was organizing last year, and utilizing that same foundation, right? Let's build things based on a foundation of belonging, of concepts of self-actualization, of wellness, versus let's just focus in on a specific identity, because our identities, even just a single identity, is so complex that for even two people sharing the exact same identity, it's going to be so different. And pretending as if like I can go and create a program that's going to fit every single person just never worked for me. So I kind of just went and did my own thing. And then now, like I mentioned, I'm kind of doing my master's as I'm also working with various groups in conflict transformation and social justice, which is kind of inclusive of a lot of these different things. And so it's just like, it kind of just one thing led to the other. But a lot of it really did, I don't want to say it like completely started, because again, I was doing a lot of, in particular, mental health and sexual assault prevention work. And I was doing that a little bit with the Muslim community in like Massachusetts, but it really wasn't until like that wake up call, right? Of that recognition of someone needs to do this for us. Because I think prior to that, I was taught within the nonprofit industrial complex, and I've been reflecting on this recently. Like when I first started work in college, it was specifically for us, right? It was at the time it was for mental health and like sexual assault prevention, and it was for the survivors, right? It was people living with mental health challenges. But then as I got into nonprofits, it's interesting how like almost overnight that had to shift, and then it became for the most privileged to be with us, right? To be able to be safe, to be able to honor all that kind of stuff. But it was entirely for them, right? It was how do I get a cis white non-Muslim male, right, to understand anything about me, to understand anything about Muslims. And I think that interaction with that individual was such a powerful reminder of like, you know what, I don't want my work to be for the privileged folks, right? Like there's enough people doing that work. I'm here for us, right? There aren't enough people doing this work only for us, right? Like exclusively for us. And I'll always say that like if a privileged person learns along the way, great. But like
come along for the journey.
Exactly. But I'm not building it for you. I'm building it for us.
No, that, you know, it's so fascinating, because I think like, you know, like I've worked for a long time in nonprofits, and you know, we're talking about like sort of almost like segmenting who you are to fit in this bucket for this grant or this bucket for that grant is so real, right? And that's some of the ways that like white supremacy and patriarchy shows up in some of these industrial in the non-profit industrial complex, where your identity sort of, you're asked to factor into different places, and it impacts so severely folks who have all of these pieces, you know, and that, you know, and that comment that you talked about, like how like literally you can be born in the same place and have very like, from the outside perspective, very sort of similar upbringing, culture, watch the same TV show at the same exact time, and your identity is so different. And that's one of the amazing things I think about the work that you've been doing, and sort of, you know, and why we really wanted to have this conversation, because, you know, I think there's people out there who even think that queer Muslims don't even exist, right? Like, you know, like it's sort of like when you think of other religions or other cultures, or you know, people are like, oh yeah, they exist, right? Like gay Christians exist and gay pagans exist, but like people here, you know, Muslims, and there's all these misconceptions, and there's these things that we are fed through media and sort of fear and fear mongering So they don't even think people like you exist, right? And then to think about that there's even more people like you, that you're not the only one, right? Like you're not this like one in a million people. There's thousands and thousands of people, and we have them here, like in New Haven. They're here. They're in Connecticut. They're in Massachusetts. They're all over the place. So it's important to have this conversation so people can start to understand that identities exist in so many more layers. Having said that, and speaking about identities, our guest of honor is here, so I'm going to try to bring them on. So let's see if this works. Let's see if technology finally cooperates with us. Hello, you're on
Hello.
with us. Okay, perfect.
Awesome.
So
how are you both?
Say that again.
How are you both doing today?
We are great. We were having a side conversation, waiting for our guest of honor to be here. And
I'm guest of honor. Wow.
Yeah.
I feel so special now.
You should. All right. So I'll let you continue
What was the question?
Conversation. So I had asked Ahmed to introduce themselves. Now I'm going to ask you the same. Can you introduce yourself and tell us a little about who you are?
I work here in downtown New Haven on Chapel Street at 10,000 Villages. I'm the manager here. I've been back in New Haven years. I moved to New Haven maybe around 2001 before. And then before that, I was living in Norwalk. I was in the service. And I grew up in Pennsylvania. And that's about it.
That's a lot. Thank you.
That's a lot. Okay.
It's amazing stuff. So thank you for sharing that with us. So some of I was reflecting on some of what Ahmed said, and I will let them take over moderating because they're supposed to be the moderator of the conversation. Okay. Go ahead, Ahmed.
Great. Awesome. Yeah. So Shaamsuldhin, so excited that you're able to join us. Thank you for that introduction. So I know for like this conversation, we really just wanted to talk about just our own lives, right? Like some of the challenges that we've experienced, some of our like hopes, our visions for like various communities and things like that. And so want to kind of like jump right in because I know this is the first time that we're meeting. This is our first conversation. And for me, at least, it's so refreshing to meet another like queer Muslim.
Yes.
I don't know about you, but I don't meet many, even though I do this work, right? And specifically outside of this work, I don't meet many people. So would you mind telling us a little bit about your experiences and we can kind of go from there?
Well, as I said, I became Muslim, converted when I was in high school, my senior year. Literally, like I took my Shahada at the end of Ramadan. And my very first Ramadan, I was on my own in the army. And it was hard. But I mean, you learn, you read, you go through, you learn things. And I was in Korea too. So I would literally like have to get off on Fridays to go to the masjid, and wound up they had a phenomenal library. Of course, everything in the library was in Arabic. So it was like, can I find something in English? So I guess as a Muslim, the biggest thing is it's a struggle. We all know that. The true meaning of that word that we're not supposed to say. It's a struggle. And it's a struggle. I'm diabetic now presently, so I shouldn't be fasting during Ramadan. But I try to, so it's a struggle. Every day is a struggle. Like with I think any community or any person.
Yeah, absolutely. And I definitely relate to that in terms of like that struggle. And it's, I think specifically for like, and for various identities, right? But for like us as queer Muslims and carrying other identities, right? So like I'm Palestinian and a refugee and you carry various identities, and it's always so fascinating of like having to negotiate every single one of those identities. And I think in particular, for me at least, and I know for a lot of people that I know, especially with like queer and Muslim identity, they're seen as so conflicting, right? That there's almost like very little space for either of those identities for us to be able to really negotiate. So I'd love to hear.
Right. You're totally right. being a black man, being an American, being Muslim, being queer, being a drag performer, those things just don't blend. It's a melange, and you find the recipe that works for you. And people say, well, you can't be that, you can't be this. I mean, in life, you can be just about anything you want to be. It's just, and you're only being yourself. And people don't understand that, because their preconceived notions, and we all have that about, like, if you're dealing with a conservative Republican, I'm like, okay, I respect conservatives, I respect republicanism, I disagree with it, but they have a right to be here and exist. Where unfortunately, from our community, the Muslim community, and then maybe even you as a Palestinian, and then me as an African American, oh no, we don't do that. That's, no, 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 that's not acceptable. And it's like, well, I'm here and there's a lot more of us, but so what about it?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And often, like, I'll share, because I've been doing this work since I was like 17, and I've been receiving death threats basically since the first time I started doing any work around Islamophobia, and even just about like being Palestinian. And really, the only identity I've ever received a death threat for, that just like a single identity, has only been like the Palestine one, but everything else has always been two or more identities. So like I've never received a death threat for just being queer, but I have received death threats from both the straight and the queer community for being queer and Muslim, right? Or trans and Muslim, and various identities, or being a refugee and queer, right? And it's interesting how like there's so many messages, right, that tell us it's impossible that those things can come together, right? That somehow we're not understanding our own identities, when in reality it's no, they just don't get it. Like that's on them. Whereas like for me, like identities do make sense together, right? Like you said,
Yes,
we could be an unlimited amount of identities, and like that's natural, right? Like that's beautiful. And I feel like we've structured society in a way where unless you fit certain boxes, right, of what's appropriate and what's not, you're not allowed to exist, right? There's something inherently wrong with you. Um, yeah.
it's a sadness because I think everybody experiences that. And I always, as I said, as a drag performer, my drag name is Layla Alf Walela, which is Alf Layla Walela, 1001 Nights. And if you read 1001 Nights, the first time I did, I was utterly shocked because it contains everything that we as Muslims say, no, 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 no. It's kind of like, here in the Western world or the Christian world, Harry Potter, like conservative Christians, oh no, it's the devil, blah, blah, blah. And like Alf Layla wa Layla is like, it is the antithesis of everything that we say. But I'm like, that just goes to prove that even 1,000, 1,500, 1,700 years ago, people still had all these different identities. And even from the hadith, where you have like Hit, the one transgendered person who was accused by certain things by some of the prophet's companions, or even there was the great musician Tuwais. I can't remember which instrument they played, but those identities existed. I even read one reference where it said that at one point that some of the people who actually were guardians of the Kaaba would be what we would call transgendered people. And it's like, it's just, if you look long enough and hard enough, you can find evidence to support anything. If you want to believe that pigs fly, you can find somewhere that pigs fly. It's, ironically, pigs. I guess people just don't understand the breathtaking, astounding variety of life. I mean, and like one of my passions is astrophysics. And when you start to realize how unimaginably vast the universe is, and then there's the possibility that there could be a multiplicity of universes, it boggles your mind. And you're like, you're really concerned that I'm wearing this and not that? You know, really, in the great scheme of things, in the, like I said, in the vast enormity of the universe, does this really matter? It matters to me, it matters to us. But on the great cosmic scale, is that really something you can't deal with? Clearly, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. It's almost kind of validating though when like they send us that hate. It's like, wow, I'm so important in the scheme of everything. I matter so much in your life.
Hmm.
You're welcome. I just gave you purpose. Um, yeah,
I
that's
know.
absolutely
I
true.
feel the hate. I feel the hate. I feel the hate. I mean, and I've just learned how to deal with it. Just what is it? Who was it who said it? Like water off a duck's back? Was that Jinx Monsoon? That was like her mantra. It's just like, you gotta let you just have to accept it that that's going to be some people's worldview, that they can't think outside of the box.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm curious, just selfishly, right? Since this is our first conversation, I would love to hear about like how you've built community, right? So as a queer Muslim, carrying all those other identities that you mentioned, right? Being a black man, a drag performer, all of those different things. What kind of community have you built? Where do you feel at home?
I mean, I'm an introvert. So that for me, I'm totally fine being alone. I I'm sadly I've said that I've in the Western world there are Sunday morning or Easter Sunday Christians. I know my Quran, I know my Hadith. If people come in and they see all my books and like, wow, you know all this stuff, and I can talk about things, but I don't go to the masjid with, a rainbow flag on or rainbow takia advertising this because I understand that some people are just going to be, huh, what? So I go to the masjid for Ramadan and that's it. If I feel like I need to go any other time, I try to do salat. And if I feel like I need to fast a little, I'll fast a little. But I feel like that my Islam, as we all learn, it's between me and the law. And if I'm wrong, he or she will judge it as such. And he, she, they, it, whatever will judge it as such. But people just can't, they can't. It's whether it's their, especially those from the Middle East, they have that inculated and built in them for so long. And I do have Muslim friends who have told me, unfortunately, that there is a lot of that things going on amongst Muslim communities where abuse takes place between the older generation abusing the younger generation and things like that. So, as for building community, the people that I know are the ones that I know, and we discuss and I share ideas. But as I said, I'm out, I don't hide it. But by the same token, I don't go to the masjid and, say, hey, whatever, because that's not going to fly. That's not going to go into some people's ears. So I build my community by just being myself and not hiding anything. Like, I walk around all the time with my lapel pins. Like right now, it's a little centaur, and he's very pretty, but it lets you know who and what I am, and or my rainbow flags on my lapel. So if you can see it, you see it, but some people don't.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can definitely relate to that. In particular to like that last point. So I've been like fairly public about being non-binary and trans and queer, and I've written articles about it and all that kind of stuff. And when I had social media, I used to have it on like social media, and it's always so amusing where like a few years later, someone will be like, "Wait, you're non-binary?" And I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, you just haven't been paying attention. Like, I don't need to go and have a conversation with everybody.
Yes.
So absolutely, I can definitely relate to that. I do think I do find that like it's kind of interesting with like the specifically like the Middle Eastern community or the South Asian community here, and things like that where. So like my family's Palestinian, so I grew up in the United States, but now my parents live in Jordan, and
Okay.
so I'm constantly kind of going back and forth, and it's always over the last years it's been so fascinating to me where I feel so much safer as a queer and trans person in Jordan than I do in the US.
Okay.
Specifically because, and most people are like shocked by this, but specifically because in Jordan, which is like 50% Palestinian, 50% Jordanian, right? You have now quite a few like Syrians and things like that. But over there, their culture is more of when someone disagrees with you, maybe they'll glare at you, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they'll walk away or something. But like very few will actually say anything. Over here, when someone disagrees with me, they send me a death threat, right? And like it becomes an entire thing. And it's really interesting to think of that as like how over there, even though like I know more queer and trans people over there, queer and trans Muslims over there than I do like in the state of Connecticut. And it's interesting because it's almost like an invisible community that there is a lot of vibrance that exists within it, and it's really interesting of how as people come from different places, how their identities shift. Like I saw this even with my parents, right, where the way they were in the United States is very different than how they are in Jordan, where it's almost because they're far away from their own communities, they become almost like the most extreme version of the things that they know, right? And so all of a sudden, everything is like scary, right? So anything that happens is like, oh my God, we need to like stop this. It's scary. We don't know what's happening, right? Like we're not in a safe place. And I recognize that a lot of that comes from like as a trauma response and things like that. But it was really interesting, like moving to Jordan as like in high school and like finding queer and trans community there, right? And like having space and it was just really interesting because it's the exact opposite of what you would imagine, where you'd imagine that here we would have
more openness
like,
and more
trans spaces. Exactly. Whereas like I honestly feel the opposite, and it's the same way with like it's not even just Jordan. Like I felt similar things in like Egypt and Turkey. I haven't traveled as extensively in like South Asia. Like I've traveled, but like I wasn't really a part of the community much there. But yeah, so it's really fascinating how all of that works. Yes.
In the Jordanian community, the Muslims predominantly there, are they Sunni or Shia?
Mostly Sunni.
Mostly Sunni, because I know the Shia are. I don't consider myself Sunni or Shia. I mean, I kind of like. I feel like Imam Ali should have been given the the whatever of the Islamic community, that kind of Catholic what do they call it, investiture. But okay, whatever. But I know with Shia Muslims, in fact, especially under Imam Khomeini, I had read where there was actually a trans woman who made her way into his presence and like persuaded him to pull back some of the lines and allow trans Muslims in Shia nations. And so like in amongst Shias, you can actually, if you identify as a woman, you can actually like get a sex change from the state. Whereas, Sunnis are still like, oh no, one or the other, which is of course is the irony, because even the great scholars of the past accepted that there were a third gender. I mean, what is the whole thing about it? But I find it interesting that you do find more community amongst Middle Eastern and South Asian people, but it only makes sense because you're in a group of people who are more like you, if you will. And then if you go into that sub community of as a queer Muslim, of course you're going to find that. So of course there's going to be nightclubs and etc. So that only makes sense that you see that you happen to find that community, especially coming from that kind of culture. Although you are a second generation American.
No, I'm not even a U.S. citizen.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So third generation displaced, but because of war and everything, we're kind of all over the place. So it gets pretty complicated. But like to your point in terms of like the historical pieces, actually over the last couple of months, I was reading a book. I'll have to like look up its name, but it's basically about homosexuality in the Arab world, right? From the 1300s to the 1900s, and it kind of talks about how in
Islam, is that the name of it?
Yeah.
I've read that one.
Oh, nice. Okay, awesome. Yeah, and I read that in particular because having conversations with like my grandfather who was born in like pre-Israel Palestine, right, and pre-war. his generation of Palestinians are so much more accepting of queer and trans identity than their kids are, right? Because their kids grew up post-colonization.
Under
so him
colonization
talking about things, yeah, exactly. And so like that kind of got me interested in like really reading that, of like at what point did things shift over. And in that book it really highlights how, as like Arab scholars, right, Muslim scholars, as they started learning in like Europe, right, going to school in Europe, and they have very specific examples of how like poetry used to be like, in like the Arabic language used to be like very queer positive, right? And I don't think it really goes into transness as much. Yeah, exactly. And how that started shifting, right? Once people started studying like in France and in England, they would come back and be like, oh, this is perverted, this is gross. And how like subtly that shift happened, right? Where like my grandfather passed away last year. I believe he was 89. You know, so his generation like held on to a lot of those things, and how unfortunately like we've lost so much of it. And so I know like a lot of the work that I do in like Jordan and places like that is really about how do we reclaim a lot of those things, right? Of the things that we've been taught through like white supremacy and imperialism and all of these systems that have told us that there's something inherently wrong with us, right? Of whatever we are, right? It's not even about like especially when you have multiple identities of marginalization, right? Like it's not even just about queer or trans or Muslim, or it's literally everything, right? Whatever identity that's not white, cis, straight, and rich and Catholic, and like all of the more privileged identities. And so it's wonderful to hear like how you've been able to kind of navigate that and build your own spaces and kind of look into some of this work on your own. And that's always so beautiful to hear about, because I know that's one of the things that like I've had to do, and it's still something I work on like every day, right? And something I'm very invested in, of also how do we build more intentional spaces that will be able to be safe for us, right?
I think just like the Christian world, you know, they had to have the Reformation and the Enlightenment. The Muslim world is going to have that as well, where people are going to have to actually sit down and question, you know, the great scholars of hadith and whatnot. And although you get this this Wahhabism and this neo-traditionalism where we have to do everything exactly like the Salaf did, you know, this whole idea of Salafism, it's like we don't live in the desert anymore. We don't ride camels. You have a home and you hear the adhan on your cell phone. So, you know, you have to accept this notion that things change to some degree. That's the paradox, but they can't accept that paradox, and I'm baffled by it. Just as they are probably baffled by us, I'm baffled by their inability to see that the world is changing. As a paradox, the more things change, the more they stay the same. I get that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I find it so interesting of how like certain narratives just take up like so much space in like the media and just the spaces that we have, right, in terms of our subconscious. It was actually really interesting the last few weeks. I spent a couple of weeks in like the desert in Jordan, so predominantly hanging out with like Bedouins, right, like people who have never had like a home. They don't have Wi-Fi, right, like they'll talk a lot to tourists and things like that, but they've held on to all of their like practices, like even like different religious like ceremonies that like they identify as Muslim for the most part, but they still have different religious practices that are from like the Roman times, right, or the Nabatean times from thousands of years ago.
Wow.
And it was really, really fascinating in the sense of they had no problem with queerness. They had no problem with transness. Like I can be wearing the biggest earrings, wear whatever I want, right? Like, and people can usually tell that like I'm trans on like some subconscious level as soon as they see me. And it was so fascinating because I think at times like we have this narrative, right, of who understands and who doesn't. And I think so much of that is taught to us through like an imperialist and like white supremacist lens. And
Mm-hmm.
it's so fascinating with how diverse just we all are, right? Like there's over 1 billion Muslims in the world, and like I've never met two that are the same, right? And
No.
like um, yeah, and like we're so diverse, we're so beautifully complex, and I always love being in spaces like that, right, where you've been taught something and all of a sudden your experience challenges it, and that for me is like how I grow a lot, and it's really taught me to really question every narrative. And so I kind of want to shift the conversation a little bit for our last like 15 minutes to talk a little bit about the narratives here, right? And like the perceptions that we have here, and ultimately like what would be our vision of building a like specifically a Muslim inclusive like queer and trans community, right? I don't know about you, but I know I don't feel safe in the vast majority of like queer and trans spaces that are predominantly white, right? Like, unfortunately, a lot of services are entirely white, or and so they're either like anti-Muslim or anti-immigrant or anti-black and anti-brown and all of those different things. So, would love to hear like your vision of what do you think needs to happen and what could it look like, right, in the future where Muslims are included and Black people are included and immigrants are included and so on and so forth.
I really, there needs to be, in a word, revolution, whether it's cultural, that people's ideas have to be broken down and questioned. And I'm a huge proponent of that. It's like I ask questions. I ask questions. That's what brought me to Islam. It's like I ask questions. I just can't sit down, shut up, and believe. Like literally, even in making my salah, the dua that you make, that you're supposed to supplicate and then ask Allah to bless the Prophet, peace be upon him. I dropped that. For me, my salah is just me and Allah and reciting Quran, and then I'll make that supplication after I greet the two angels. It's I question everything. If it does not make sense to me, some things I know you accept on faith, but if it really doesn't make sense to me, I'm like, and it'll keep turning over and over and over. It has to be that people are willing to ask questions. And the one thing that I've always had the issue with where people can't accept queerness, the whole umbrella, that you have to be gay or straight, which is not necessarily it. I'm like, well, look at the day. There's day and night. The simple fact is that before the sun rises, you slowly see the darkness fade. And when the day is ending, you slowly see the light fade. That's just an example of human beings that you can go from someone who's masculine, cisgendered, heteronormative, whatever, to slowly that whole transition of, oh, someone who's non-binary, someone who's questioning, someone who's masked but identifies I am astounded. To me, I see that as Allah's handiwork, that he is so great that he creates literally this boundless universe as far as we can see. And there's so much difference and paradox. And you have to realize, well, even with all of that difference and paradox, you're just like me. I'm just like you. And if we can't get to that point, then I really don't know. I think there has to be people's minds, a revolution of ideas. People's minds have to be challenged. You have to challenge people. And just like with Billy Porter and I can't think of the trans woman from Pose, people's ideas have to be challenged. You have to challenge people. And the best way to challenge people is simply to be yourself. And that's a difficult, it's easy, but it's a very difficult task. I happen to live in a rough neighborhood and I'm participating in the MX pageant this Friday. So when I walk out my front door with all of my accoutrement, they're going to see part of Layla in the transformation. So that's a challenge to that. You just have to be yourself. And that's the only way things are going to change, because if there's enough of us being ourselves, then some people are going to get it. Oh, my cousin's like that. or my aunt's like that, or my nephew's like that. So I've known them all my life and they're a decent human being. So how can this be bad? It's just the law's handiwork. That's how I see it.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that idea of a full scale revolution, right? Which is just necessary across the board. Unfortunately, like we have so many societal problems, right? So many inequities that nothing less than a revolution is really going to get us there. And I love the idea
Going to
of really
change it.
challenging
Even
people.
10, 11 years I'm sorry, 10 and 11 years ago in the Muslim world, there was the Arab Spring. You remember that? How there was all this angst and whatnot coming out because people wanted to be free. And I think that people have to be free to be themselves. We live here in the Western world. I see some young women on the streets and I'm like, oh, I would never wear that. But they have to be free to wear that. They have to, that's their right. It's you have to give people autonomy over themselves and let them be themselves. And if you can't do that, then you're oppressing people. We know that oppression is wrong in Islam. Yes?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I was actually living maybe 15 minutes away from the Syrian border when
Mm-hmm.
the Syrian revolution started, and so I was in Jordan when Tunis happened, when Egypt happened, and it's a much longer conversation. It's so much trauma and pain within a lot of that of kind of the events of like what happened after, and I find that I think I find that that's a really great example of how even when people come together to really build a revolution, until we've really built infrastructure and addressed kind of these broader systems, or at least
Mm-hmm.
are really conscious of them, it's amazing how quickly they can sabotage and hijack that spirit that we're talking about, right? And
Yeah.
it was a really interesting time to be living there, of seeing
During the Arab
people
Spring.
just during the Arab Spring, and seeing how empowered people were, right, and how motivated and inspired, and how quickly that began to turn. And so that's definitely a separate conversation, a much longer conversation that we can go into another time. Um, but I love all of that. One thing that I always tell people who aren't familiar, like with immigrants and with Muslims and all that kind of stuff, and I mean we're at a state where unfortunately every single one of us has been conditioned into these systems of oppression, right? Like anti-blackness is woven into everything in our lives. Anti-Muslim like sentiment is woven into everything. Like indigenous and anti-queer, anti-trans, all of these different things. And I always tell people that they also need to begin challenging themselves. Of like, if you haven't done this work isn't going to get done on its own, right? Like
No,
if you
it's
haven't
not.
done it, it's still there. It needs to get done. We're all carrying these things, and like I know if I didn't go into like working on anti-blackness, right, and then covering all of the learned things that I was learned in school, and things like that, right? Like I would never have been safe to Black people, right? And it's something I have to be accountable for and like demand of myself, and so I kind of demand that of other people when it comes to Muslim identities and refugee identities and immigrant identities and Arab identities or South Asian identities or
Yes.
all various identities. Because there is work that needs to be done. And so really want to put it out there for our listeners, right? If you don't have any of these shared identities that we're discussing, this is time for you to kind of interrogate that, for you to look into where you want to go from here, right? How you can build space for individuals. Those spaces are not going to create themselves. It's not
No.
just let's build a
Which
space that's
is going to
exclusionary. Right, exactly. And so, and so really wanted to put that out there as well as we build that revolution. And I truly believe that as we interrogate our own lives and really challenge the people around us little by little, right, we can build that revolution, right? We can get to a stage where it does become a mass movement, where we have to question everything, where we move everything forward versus just one little thing at a time.
Yes. But you're right. We have, I think, they say if you want to change the world, change yourself. That's how you start. That really is. The hardest work is working on yourself. And as the prophet said, that is jihad, starting with yourself. It's the struggle against the lower self, about our own ignorance, jahiliya. We are struggling against that. And that is the racism, the homophobia, the sexism, the anti-transgenderism. It's all of that. It's struggling against what we've been taught, that no one can be different. And even the people who are just so conservative and they're not going to change, I'm like, you know what? I respect them. They have the right to exist too. I disagree with them, and I will, what's the word? I will definitely tell them I disagree with them. But you know what? You still deserve my respect as a human being.
Yeah, absolutely. That's beautiful. So I know we only have a few more minutes. So I wanted to just ask one final question.
Sure.
And I want this to be kind of directed to like other queer and trans Muslims. If there's anything that you want to say directly to our community, right? Whatever words that you would like. Just wanted to give a space to also talk directly to that community.
Um, I feel that as an American, I'm like so blessed to be here in America. And I often wonder about, like some trans kid or some gay kid like in Saudi or somewhere in Africa in a Muslim community. You have to, I really wish that we had some kind of foundation or organization to help young people like that. But I guess the best thing that we can do as here as Americans, be examples of the change we want to see. So being ourselves, when you look at somebody like Billy Porter or Little Nas, and all of these great, illustrious queer celebrities, it would be nice if we had some illustrious, great queer Muslim celebrities as well, so that that message would, slowly go around the world. Even though we know that we would have to fight against the clerics and the people who say haram, 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 bidda, shar, etc. You still have to be yourself at the end of the day. When you stand before Allah on Yawm Qiyamah, you have to answer to Allah, not to somebody who said, you can't be yourself. And I think we as Westerners, we have to be that example, because those kids in those repressive communities don't have that. They need that example. Just as we as African Americans needed Black people to succeed here in America and say, see, I can do that too, or in any other nation. So we have to be those examples.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that idea of really having visibility as queer and trans Muslims. Because I can't really think of any myself or like many like prominent queer and trans Muslim figures. There are a few, but not many that really do have a lot of that visibility. And as I guess as a final thing from my end, really just want to send love to the queer and trans Muslim community, both in the United States and elsewhere around the world. I know it's not an easy community to be a part of, in the sense of we don't have a ton of resources, even in the United States. I know in the US, there have been a few different organizations that have supported queer and trans Muslims. Masjid Rabia and Masjid kind of come to mind. They both hold. And that's yeah, absolutely, yeah. And so there are a few different organizations. There is. I think it's called Iman in England and Scotland. There's an organization out. There's various organizations kind of everywhere, and even other places. I know in Jordan there's a couple like smaller organizations that are kind of doing different work. Yeah, and just really want to kind of close with just really that hope for that revolution that Shaamsuldhin you kind of mentioned. really, the thoughts of individuals kind of really examining their own belief systems, which I think is inclusive of queer and trans Muslims ourselves, right? Of really interrogating our own anti-Blackness, our anti-immigrant sentiments, and so on and so forth. But yeah, just thank you
The
all so much
struggle
for
continues.
listening. Yeah, absolutely. The struggle continues. So Juan Carlos, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you. And thank you both for having such an open and honest conversation. We appreciate it. And to everyone watching, thank you for helping us celebrate Pride. Again, this is part of Pride New Haven, which is taking place till September 19th. So we hope to see you at many more of our events. And you can check out the full schedule at newhavenpridecenter.org/2021 Pride. I want to take a moment to thank all our amazing Pride co-producers, Gotham City Empire Group, and all the presenting sponsors like the Community Foundation of Greater New Haven, Stop and Shop, the City of New Haven Department of Arts, Culture, and Tourism, State of Connecticut Department of Economic and Community Development, Gilead, Healthcare Advocates International, and also all of you for being a part of Pride. So we hope to see you at the events that are remaining to come. And happy Pride, everyone. Have a great day.
Happy Pride.